What if I told you the big push to cut interest rates has very little to do with your mortgage or car loan, and everything to do with something much, much bigger? You've probably heard all the talk about the Federal Reserve needing to lower rates. The usual argument sounds simple. Lower rates mean cheaper mortgages, lower credit card payments, and easier loans for businesses. But that's not the whole story. In fact, the real reason runs much deeper, and it has massive consequences for our economy, for taxpayers, and for investors like you and me. So today I'm going to break down the hidden reason interest rates matter so much, why the government is so desperate for cuts, and how this whole situation could actually create opportunities for you if you know where to look. First, let's clear up a common myth about the Federal Reserve. Despite the name, the Fed isn't federal in the way most people think. It's not a bank where you or I can open a savings account. It doesn't sit on giant piles of cash like a vault, and it doesn't take direct orders from the US government. It's an independent central bank, but the decisions it makes, especially on interest rates, affect everyone. They affect banks, they affect you and me, and they affect the single biggest borrower in the entire world, the United States government. Right now, America owes over $37 trillion in national debt. That makes the government, by far, the largest borrower on the planet. So when the Fed raises interest rates, yes, it makes your mortgage or car loan more expensive, but it also makes the government's debt a lot more expensive to maintain. Who exactly does the US owe all this money to? It's not just foreign countries like Japan, the UK, or China, though they do own big chunks of US treasuries. It's also regular investors, retirement funds, banks, and even the Federal Reserve itself. When you buy a treasury bond, you're essentially lending money to the government. In return, they promise to pay you back with interest. It's considered one of the safest investments in the world because the US always pays its bills. But here's the twist. When rates are high, the government has to pay a lot more interest on that $37 trillion tab. In fact, interest on the national debt is now the fastest growing expense in Washington. Not defense, not healthcare, not infrastructure. Who's interested? And where does the money to pay for that come from? Your taxes. Let's talk about that. The government has one main source of income. Taxes collected from people like you and me. There are all kinds. Income tax on your paycheck, payroll taxes like Social Security capital gains, when you sell investments, sales tax. When you shop, property tax on your home, corporate taxes. On company profits, tariffs, state, and local taxes. The list goes on and on. Add it all up, and in 2025, the government expects to collect about $5.2 trillion. Sounds like a lot, right? But here's the problem. Spending is even higher. The projected deficit for this year alone is around $1.9 trillion. That's more money being borrowed on top of what we already owe. And when borrowing keeps climbing while interest rates stay high, a bigger and bigger slice of your tax dollars ends up going just to cover interest payments, rather than paying for things like schools, roads, healthcare, or national defense. This is why there's such urgency around lowering rates. For every 1% reduction in interest costs, the government could save about $370 billion a year. That's why policymakers keep talking about rate cuts. It's not just about helping families refinance mortgages. It's about keeping the government's debt bill from spiraling further out of control. But here's the double-edged sword. Lower rates make borrowing cheaper. That can encourage growth, but it can also encourage overspending by households, businesses, and by the government itself. And when spending outpaces real growth, it pushes up inflation. Prices climb, your paycheck buys less, and the cycle continues. So even though cutting rates might offer short-term relief, it doesn't solve the underlying problem of overspending and rising debt. Now, you might be thinking, well, can't we just raise taxes or cut spending? In theory, yes, but in practice, neither option is popular. Raising taxes sparks outrage because nobody likes seeing more money vanish from their paycheck, and cutting spending sounds good on paper. But government spending also funds salaries, contracts, and services that millions of people depend on. Pull that back too fast, and you risk slowing the economy down even more. That's the dilemma. The US has been operating without a truly balanced budget for decades. We've gotten used to spending more than we bring in, but eventually, that carries a cost. And this is where inflation comes in. Our dollars today aren't backed by gold or silver. They're just paper currency, created by the Federal Reserve. When the government spends more than it earns, it has to borrow. And when lenders don't cover all of it, the Fed can step in and essentially print new money to buy that debt. Printing more money doesn't create more wealth, it just creates more dollars chasing the same amount of goods. And that, my friends, is the textbook definition of inflation. Over time, the value of each dollar shrinks, prices rise, and the average worker's salary doesn't keep up. That's why it feels like your savings and your paycheck by less and less than they used to. Meanwhile, investors often come out ahead. Why? Because assets like stocks and real estate tend to rise with inflation. Just look at housing prices over the past 50 years. Look at how rents have climbed, or the way the S&P 500 has grown. Inflation pushes those values up, which is why investors tend to benefit more than savers in this kind of system. So what can you actually do about it? Well, one option is to lend to the government yourself and collect those higher interest payments. For example, there are Treasury ETFs that pay monthly dividends tied to government bonds. At today's rates, some of these are paying over 4% annually. Now, a quick disclaimer. I am not your financial advisor. Investing always carries risk, and you can lose money. Always do your own research. But here's how those Treasury ETFs work. The share price stays fairly stable, and you get interest payments as dividends. Those dividends are also usually exempt from state and local taxes, which can make them even more attractive. The risk? If interest rates fall, those payouts will shrink. And of course, the bigger, long-term risk is that inflation eats away at the real value of your returns. Beyond that, investing in stocks and real estate remains a proven way to beat inflation over the long haul. Historically, assets have grown faster than the value of cash just sitting idle in a bank account. Here's the bottom line. Interest rates aren't just about your mortgage or your credit card bill. They're about the government's ability to manage a mountain of debt. When more than $1 trillion a year goes just to pay interest, that affects every taxpayer and every single part of the economy. And while we can't control what the Fed does next, we can control how we prepare. In times of high inflation, savers often get punished. Investors who understand the system, however, often come out ahead. So what do you think? Should the Fed cut rates now to ease the debt burden, or keep them high to fight inflation? Drop your opinion in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. And if this breakdown gave you a new perspective, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share this video with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe for more real talk about money, debt, and investing. Because this story, it's only just getting started.